Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce Robin. He doesn't actually need much introduction. I suffice it to say that I really am thrilled to bits that he's been in the History Society for 9 years. We're coming up to our 10th year. And he does enormous amount of work to make Hermanus history visible. There are articles, there's Facebook, which we transfer to our website, and their books. And his latest book for keeps is available in the library as well. So we're all excited about High Street, and it's so good that we're accompanying the opening of High Street with a history that will be available to everyone. And many of you have seen High Street, and it's a great improvement. So it might also be the beginning of tidying up the CBD, dream on, but let's hope so. So welcome, Robin, and I look forward to hearing you talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. I've entitled this presentation, The History of High Street Hermanus, on the expectation that when this video goes viral internationally, there will be people who don't know much about where High Street is or may confuse it with High Street in their own town. So I put the word in Hermanus, High Street Hermanus, though most of those who are viewing it now, of course, will know what I mean. High Street is not the most important street in Hermanus. I think I must make that clear. Main Road is clearly the most important, and there's a strong case for Harbour Road being the second most important. But the History Society decided to look into High Street in 2016, when it was becoming very clear that a redevelopment would take place and that High Street, as we knew it, would disappear and be replaced with a superior street. So it's an opportunistic piece of research, but it turned out to be very interesting. The work started 5 years ago, but went on hold when there was a long delay while they worked on the stormwater aspects of High Street, which I'm not going to talk about today. And then, of course, COVID interfered with research quite seriously. So I decided to take it up alone, independently of the group that originally researched High Street, because we couldn't even meet as a group. So this is partly the group's research and partly my own research since 2016. Here is a map, which among many other things, shows you in the yellow what roughly is the central business district of Hermanus. It's bordered on the mountainside by Royal Road, with circles, of course, as you know, known as the Relief Road. On the east by Lord Roberts Road, technically on the seaside by Main Road, though you could well include Marine Drive in the CBD, and then on the west by Harbour Road and Main Road itself again, which, as you know, makes a right angle at the corner where my cursor is now. High Street, as you see, is a relatively secondary street in the CBD, and we researched it for the reasons that I gave. The History Society had previously done both Long Street and Aberdeen Street, so we're now beginning to get a good picture of the history of the CBD. Because there may be an international audience for this video, very roughly I'm going to show you the histories. First of all, Hermanus Peters discovered a little spring or fountain where along Marine Drive, as it now is, and he gave his name to the village, Hermanus Peters Fontaine. That was sometime during the 1830s. It didn't refer to anything other than the fountain at that time. But in 1855, it came to be applied to the little village, which the first fisher folk settled. There were 5 families from Heddy's Bay, Horston, and they came round to develop a harbour at the Fiss Bay, the old harbour as we know it. In the same year, the first sites were sold, By the 1860s, there were houses being built along what became Westcliff Road. In 1868, the first shop opened in the Warringtons' home in Marine Drive. St. Peter's Church was built in wood in 1868 and then in stone in 1871. Sites were surveyed in Main Road and Harbour Road in 1871, and then the first sites were surveyed in High Street, Long Street, Aberdeen Street and Mitchell Street in 1874. 1878, the Dutch Reformed Church was built. The first local authority for Hermanus Pietersfontein only came into existence some 36 years after the village started in 1891, when a village management board was appointed to manage the little village. By 1896, most of the surveyed sites had been transferred to their first buyers, and very importantly, in that year, Walter Macfarlane opened the Victoria Hotel on the corner of Main Road and Harbour Road, which in a sense gave the little village a particular focus or central point. In 1902, the name was changed to Hermanus, and it was established as a municipality. In the next 16 years or so, the tourist trade, as we would call it, grew rapidly, and by 1920 there were no fewer than 13 hotels or guest houses in operation. And that trend continued steadily throughout the most of the 20th century, with a slight dip towards the end. In 1940, Hermanus, the municipality, joined with the Village Management Board of Mossel River and the Village Management Board of Pools Bay to form the new Hermanus municipality. And between 1840 and 1845, the town became very well known due to thousands of Allied troops who took their leave in Hermanus and spread the name far and wide. The population really was only measured seriously in the second half of the 20th century, and was in 1945, the resident population of Hermanus was only 4,400 people. The summer residence occupation of Hermanus would be at least 4 times that every year. By 1960, this had risen to 10,500, and by 1975, still a very small town, to 13,300 resident population of all ethnic groups, as they were then called. In 1976, the greatest Hermanus municipality was established, incorporating Orneris, Saint-Bai, Fisher Haven and Vermont. In 1990, the population I estimate had risen to about 20,000, although I can't get a figure for that year yet. And in 2000, Hermanus ceased to be a municipality of its own and became a town within the Overstrand municipality. Since then, of course, the population has rocketed. By 2005, it had reached 58,300. And last year, it was estimated to be of the order of 109,000 people. So that gives you some idea of the historical context of a place name located at a particular watering hole, a little village, a municipality, then the incorporation of 2 other local authorities, then a period of popularity but relatively small growth of the resident population, and then a vast expansion of the resident population by influx and the establishment of Hermanus as we know it today. I'm going to cover, first of all, the period from 1874 to 1940. This is the earliest document that we have of the actual layout of sites in Hermanus. As you'll see here in the top right-hand corner, it's document 2061 of 1874. And it sets out sites in Main Road. This is Main Road here, on both sides of Main Road, and these properties back onto High Street. And this, in effect, brought High Street into existence. as the street that ran behind the plots that faced onto Main Road. Unfortunately, it's a very small document and we can't enlarge it without losing total clarity. So we've extracted a bit to show you separately, more visibly. So these are the layout of sites in High Street. As you'll see, many of them are sites that run through from Main Road to High Street or from High Street to Mitchell Street. This is where Woolworths is roughly now, Woolworths. Checkers Centre would be about here. And these are the laid out sites with passageways indicated through High Street, which I'll say something about later. So these are the sites that we are concerned with in this particular presentation. The first people who bought there were, very importantly, local residents. They showed their confidence in the growth of Hermanus by flocking, literally flocking, to buy the sites as they came on the market. And some of those names are the oldest names in Hermanus. For instance, the family known as Hen, H-E-N-N, were basically seen, we see them as the leading family of the 5 families that came originally from Harry's Bay. The Sheriff family came with them as well. And the Allengenskier family arrived soon after the establishment of Hermanus. Later, they changed their name to Allen, and they played a very important part in the commercial development of Hermanus. This is 1/3 of the list. The earth numbers are given here, the name of the buyer, and then the transfer date. Now, it may strike you as odd that the transfer dates are some years on certain occasions and some decades on other occasions after the property was purchased. This is because all transfers were done in Cape Town, which was in no hurry to make transfers of little sites in a small village called Hermanus Pietersfontein. And so they took their time over it. This didn't prohibit the buying and selling of the sites. They were all sold conditional on their being eventually transferred to the original buyer. Here's the second third of the list, the Sheriff family again, the Woensdrecht family, very prominent in later years. Dani Woensdrecht was the fisher man who worked most closely, for instance, with Sir William Hoy when Sir William came to Hermanus. The Aprosky family, also very prominent, and again, a 4th site purchased by the Hen family. Here's the final thing. Here, most importantly, the Warrington family, one of the first 5 settler families, and the Haman family, also very crucial to Hermanus history. So we learn from this a number of things about the early village. One, the inhabitants who came as fisherfolk rapidly diversified to become settled residents with investments in housing and quite soon investments in business as well as in the fishing trade. Secondly, the town developed from about 1875 onwards inland from the 2 original roads, which were Main Road and Harbour Road. It started to develop inland away from the sea as it has continued to do. And that the origins of High Street are thus closely bound up with the original inhabitants of Hermanus. As I mentioned, one of the key dates is 1896, when Walter Macfarlane, referred to in Essia de Tooy's books as Walter Macfarlane II. There were 4 people called Walter Macfarlane who played an important role in Hermanus history. This is Walter Macfarlane II, who built the Victoria Hotel, which extended along Main Road. This is Main Road here in about 1898, and went around the corner, as I'll show you in a moment. Across the road is the balcony building, which is now the factory shop. This is Harbour Road running down to the sea. And this is what came to be known as Lem's Corner. In fact, in 1896, it was occupied by the Oblowitz family. This gave, as I said, this gave the town a center around which it has developed ever since. This is the different view of the Victoria Hotel at roughly the same time. This is Main Road here, making a corner here, and this door is right on the corner where the little jewelry shop is now, and Main Road then running away east towards Mossel River. So Victoria Hotel came around the corner and some way into the earth on Main Road. I thought it might help if you see this as it looks today. This is where the Astoria village or Astoria Center, it's technically the Astoria Center, but it's known as Astoria Village. This is the view of the portion on Main Road that would have been the front facade of the Victoria Hotel that I've just shown you. And this is the rear view of the same building taken from Long Street. The Astoria Hotel ran through from Main to Long, and therefore High Street would have dead-ended at the old Victoria Hotel, and not where it presently dead ends in Mitchell Square, or the parking area grandiosely called Mitchell Square today. So that helps you perhaps to locate it. Some of the families that we refer to, just a little detail about them so you can see that they were real people with real origins that settled in this real street in Hermanus. They originally came from Germany. The name was H-E-R-R-N, Herren, but was shortened later to Hen. The first recorded Hen, H-E-N-N, is in the Stellenbosch area, resident there in the 1790s. Johannes Michael Hen, who is probably best regarded as the first forefather of Hermanus, those are his dates, was living in Harrisby by the 1850s. They moved, as I mentioned, to Hermanus Pietersfontein in 1855, and his eldest son, Johannes, bought a site in High Street in 1874, indicating that movement by which the fisherfolk became consolidated in the settled town and began to make investments in the property of the town. Several family members lived in High Street until the 1960s, and there are family members still resident in Hermanus today. Unfortunately, the entire holdings of the Photographic Museum could only yield up one photograph of a member of the Hen family, and this is a lady, Susara Hen, seen here in her garden in High Street, probably in around 1890 or the turn of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. The Allen-Gensky family I've mentioned. Adel Allen-Gensky, the first person to come to Hermanus of that family, is shown here in the photograph seated. The other two people are not named. And the Allen-Gensky family immigrated from Imperial Russia. They first settled in Greyton, but arrived in Hermanus sometime in the 1870s. They started business as fish merchants, later became general dealers, and then branched out into all sorts of commercial activities. They built a house that faced onto Main Road and backed onto High Street, and thus they are a family which was very closely associated with High Street. In 1916, the grandson of the family built the Adelphi Cinema in Main Road, roughly where the Hermanus Pharmacy is now. And in High Street, they built accommodation for their employees of the cinema and the venue where Rossi Street is now. In 1930, David, Adel's son, bought the old sanatorium in Marine Drive and converted it to the Windsor Hotel. Members of the family were living in Hermanus until the 1980s, but to my knowledge, there are no members of the Allen-Gensky family in Hermanus today. The Sheriff family were originally from Plymouth in England. Richard, who was the first to come to South Africa, was convicted of poaching in the UK and transported to Australia, but he escaped from the convict transport in Cape Town. He had been born in England in 1839, and his movements are not known for obvious reasons. He was trying to hide from the authorities, and he arrived in Hermanus Pietersfontein in about 1860. He set up the family business in construction and in carpentry. The carpentry side was used when they built the wooden St. Peter's Church in 1868, and then he went on to build the stone church, which precedes the present church, in 1871. The Sheriff family also bought sites in High Street in 1874, and they are listed in many of the permits issued by the Hermanus Pietersfontein Village Management Board and later the Hermanus Municipality. Permits for construction and renovation of buildings often carry the name Sheriff on them. There are family residents living in Hermanus today. These are three members of the Sheriff family, standing on Hoyskopje, looking down to the old Clip School, primary school, out across towards the west. And this photograph would have been taken in the 1930s, I reckon. The Warrington family, also very prominent, part of the one of the five families that came, and also they bought several properties in Main and High Street. They originated from England, but not, we understand, from the town called Warrington. James Henry Warrington was born in Cape Town in 1826, and he moved to Harrisby, Houston, in the 1850s, and there married one of the Hen daughters, Elizabeth Hen, in 1854. They moved with other families to Hermanus Pietersfontein in 1855, and in 1858 their son John Warrington was the first child to be born in the new village. In the 1860s, James Henry and Elizabeth opened the first shop in the village. It was simply part of their own home, and they were assisted in doing so by a man named George Moore, who came from Stanford for that purpose. The first post office was located in their shop. In the 1880s, their grandson, Christian Warrington, opened the first genuine general dealer's shop in Main Road, where eventually the Princess Cafe was to be found. I managed to dig up through the photographic museum some of the building permits for the time. As you'll see here, this permit issued by the municipality, it's not clearly dated, but you can see where the date should be. It says 1920. So sometime in the 1920s, J. Hen had a kitchen built onto his house by T. Sheriff. So both of them founding families involved in the extension of an existing house in High Street at that time. And then a date that is clear, 1919, as you see from my cursor, J. Hen and T. Sheriff worked again to add a veranda to the building in High Street. There you'll see in both cases, situation, High Street, situation, High Street. I managed to get one other that could be projected. This was a house in 1922. The Warrington family had extensions to their house, as indicated in the drawing here, carried out by a company or contractor called Fish or Fisk. I can't make it very clear. Although they look to be quite substantial renovations, you'll see that the value of the building undertaken was only £35, and it was a stoop added to the existing house, again in High Street. And you see there, 13th of July, 1932. So continuously throughout this period, between the first houses being built and the 1940s, the families who bought into High Street were extending and renovating and improving their housing as soon as they could afford to do so. We now have a look at High Street in the 1950s. Here I have to give a little bit of detail about the research process, because I have a great debt of gratitude to a family who helped with the detail for High Street in the 1950s. This is the Oudendal family, and I note that a member of the family is in fact watching the presentation at the moment, Deborah. The late Mrs. Oudendal, Magda, lived with the family. She was born into the family known as Wrigley, W-R-I-G-L-E-Y, and she lived in High Street as a child and into her early 20s. And although she was at the time that I consulted her, confined to a wheelchair, we went around High Street, site by site, identifying who had lived there in the 1950s. And we collected all that data, and she and her daughter Deborah went home they now live in Full Clip, went home and came up with the first drawing of High Street in the 1950s. As you'll see, if you look closely, perhaps you put your eyes quite close to the screen, this is Main Road, where my cursor is now. This is High Street, and this is Mitchell Street. In Main Road, on the other side of the road, on the ocean side, you'll see the Marine Hotel, Hameworth, the home of the Grants, the Westcott House, and various other people living there. There's the Market Square, where Village Square Shopping Centre is now, and FNB would be in this corner here. But mainly she was concerned with people living in this area of between High Street and between Marine and High Street and Mitchell. And I'll show you now a word version of this diagram in which we first captured her memories of High Street in Hermanus. Here, as I've said, is the other side, the ocean side of Main Road. But here would be Main Road, here would be High Street, here would be Mitchell Street. We noticed here that High Street at the east end was still an open area. I think most of us can remember it still as an open area, with one little undertaker's business here on the corner. The Boucher family, the Patterson family, the Warrington family, the Van Dyke family, the Allen's house with accommodation for the employees in High Street, the Adelphi Theatre or Cinema, we might call it, the Royal Hotel, the Central Hotel, later Nielsen's Hotel, the Van Blommestein's House and Butchery, and then Long Street and the Astoria Hotel. And on the other side, facing onto High Street, she mentions a number of people living in the house that is today the optometrist, and painted that violent red, as you know, were a lady known as Baby Patterson and Feta Esterhuizen. The Warrington sisters, who worked at the Marine Hotel, were at number 19. Maria Glassberg was at number 17. The Wrigley family, of which Mrs. Oudendal was a member, at number 15, to time and today. A Hen family, Philip family, a builder known as Flip. The Swart family, the postman, Guervi Duplessis, Gunnar Hamman, I mentioned them as an old family. The Aprosky family also had a home there, as did the Geldenhuis home. So I then had this particular diagram drawn up using some more complex, and you'll see this is the eventual appearance of High Street in the 1950s. Here it is itself, sandwiched between Main and Mitchell. Down here are all the posh houses that faced onto the sea. Let's start at the other end this time, Lem's Corner. This would be Harbour Road. Here's the balcony building, now the factory shop. Here's the Astoria Hotel, the original Victoria Hotel, Long Street. And then going up, the Van Blommestein's House and Butchery, the Central Hotel, now Ackermans, the Royal Hotel, now the Royal Centre, the Royal Cafe on the corner of this passageway from High Street into Main Road and Main Road, approximately where the pharmacy is, the Adelphi Theatre running right through from Main, where the entrance was, to High Street, with the segregated coloured entrance in this little passage. The Allen House, Ardle, David, Simon, Becky, and Basil, and Clive, and the daughter Manette in the Allen House. Employees of the Adelphi Cinema, Poppy de Kock, the head usherette, Lily van Dijk, another usherette, and Ed Smallberger and his family. Edward Smallberger was the projectionist at the Adelphi Theatre. So this was very convenient. They did not have to travel very far to get to work. Van Dijk, roughly where the Cuckoo Tree restaurant is now. The Warrington House, there's a building known as Rancroft Building there. The Patterson House, the Boucher House, and then onto the open area. And so on the other side, the families that I've gone through. So we have a really good impression of what it was like in High Street in the 1950s. As you can see, it was a mixture of business and residential. Some business quite big, such as the hotels and the cinema, and others quite small. For instance, she shows you a shoe repair shop, a barber shop, and a garage, not a service station, but an outlet that sold petrol, of course. So I'm deeply indebted to the Odendaal family, not only for this, but to Mr. Wessel Odendaal, who in a different project altogether familiarized me with the construction of the new harbour, which had been supervised by his father. Now, residents in High Street in the 1950s. One of the most important residents was a lady known as Kate Warrington. And this quote in italics is taken from the memoir written by Burdine Late in 1970, remembering her childhood at the Marine Hotel in the 1940s and 50s. At that time, Mrs. Kate Warrington was the assistant housekeeper. Kate was born in Hermanus, her family being of the local fisherfolk, and she had come to work at the Marine Hotel in 1915 when she was 15 years old. She was first a maid in the hotel, and then for some years a nurse to the growing Late family of small girls. There were 4 girls. After her marriage, she continued working at the Marine. In the 1950s, when she was living in High Street, she was a stout middle-aged woman with stern features and iron grey hair pulled back into a bun. She was very capable and very kind, with an almost feudal outlook towards the hotel. Kate was special. Mother, that's Mrs. Late, the manager owner's wife, relied on her. We, the children, could never put on airs with Kate, not that we have dared to try. She never hesitated to speak her mind and would have cut us down to size very quickly if we had tried to come the boss over her. Only Mother gave her orders. So you get again a feeling of a very substantial family-based culture in High Street related to work opportunities nearby. This is a photograph of some of the Warrington family in the 1950s. The person who lived in High Street at that time was W. Warrington, William Warrington. He was usually known as Buller Warrington, and this is him here, Buller Warrington. He and his family, his wife Gladys and children, lived in a house in High Street in the 1950s. I've collected a little more detail about the Allen family. Their home was in Main Road, as you've seen. If you want to try and locate it, it's now the offices of the Hermanus Property Sales. There's a little parking area next to it. In 1916, the family opened the Adelphi Cinema, and they built employee accommodation at the rear of the house facing onto High Street. And these were the three people who lived in that accommodation during the 1950s. Edward Smallberg and family were forcibly removed from High Street under the Group Areas Act in the 1960s. The Hamann family, Gunnar Hamann, was a really very well-known person in Hermanus in the, well into, as you see, he lived until 1986, well into the last years of the 20th century, although he had been born in the 19th century in 1996. He was born in the family home, which was the cottage near the Fusbai. This cottage later became the Cypress Tree Tea Gardens and is now the Burgundy Restaurant. He served in World War I, as you'll see, being born in 1896, he was only about 18 years old. And then he worked for many years as a barman in the Bayview Hotel in Eastcliff, Pools Bay, as it was known then. In the 1930s, he and his wife opened the Cafe Royal in Main Road, and they lived in a house adjacent between Main and High Streets. He also owned 3 other houses in High Street. He was very well known as an oral historian of Hermanus, and he was an avid collector of historical newspaper clippings. The von Blomestein family lived at the west end of High Street, that is close to the Victoria Hotel, later the Astoria Hotel. They opened a butchery adjacent to their house. The front of the butchery was in Main Road, but the rear of the butchery was in High Street. They later sold the business and moved to Fulklip. Later they sold their house at Fulklip, which was demolished for the Birkenhead Hotel to be erected there. The butchery was taken over by Alvain Forster. He kept it operating there at the west end of High Street until quite late in the 20th century, but then moved it to Mitchell Street, renamed it in his own name, Forster's Butchery, and it was later known as the Meat Lover's Den. It doesn't exist as a butchery anymore, but many of you will know that Van Blomestein's, there is a butchery called Van Blomestein in the Swartdam Road, but this is no longer owned by the Van Blomestein family. This is roughly where the Van Blomestein house and butchery would have been. The rear of the house and the butchery is now the rear of the business called Ackermans, which fronts onto Main Road. The Wrigley family, from one of whose descendants I obtained most of this information, in the 1950s they lived at number 15 High Street, now Tutamen Antiques. Eric Herbert Wrigley emigrated from England in the 1930s, and quite soon after arriving here, he married Martha Brom and started a family. In the 1950s, he was working as an accountant and did the accounting for most of the hotels in Hermanus. He also had a vivid part-time career as an actor and entertainer, and appeared frequently in dramas staged in Hermanus in the early days. They had a number of children. James, the eldest son, Eric Jr., known as Ben, Molly, married a man named Kwesi de Villiers, also an old Hermanus family, Joey, who worked at the Marine Hotel as well, Magda, I mentioned, who is my informant for all of this, married Wessel Odendaal, whose father supervised the construction of the new harbour, and their youngest son, Stanley, passed away as recently as 2014. As I've mentioned, family members continue to live in Hermanus to this day. There was only one really constructive development after about 1950s in High Street, and I'll talk in a moment about the decline of High Street. The house that you see here in a fairly dilapidated state originally is the final house in Main Road before you come to what is now now Carriages. And this was owned by the Boucher family. They had their house adjacent, and later passed into the ownership of the Shaw family when Mr. Boucher married a Mrs. Shaw. In the 1990s, this was developed as the Oderhof Mall, which faced into High Street as well as onto Main Road. And this is the only piece of architecture that has really been done in High Street in recent years, which attempts to recapture something of the style of the historic town of Hermanus. The architect is Nicolette Lloyd. The hotels were very important to High Street, although they only backed onto them. Here is a picture of the Royal Hotel in about 1910, I would say, perhaps a little bit earlier than that. This is the front entrance in Main Road, and we'll be backing onto High Street. Another perspective shows the same hotel, Royal Hotel, with a residential development between it and the Central Hotel, which also backed onto High Street. And they gave a particular quality to the life in High Street by the fact that the back entrance was most often, as it was in those days, most often used by the non-European members of Hermanus society, making High Street a very different street from Main Road, just because of the width of the hotel and the social conventions of the time. Unfortunately, both of these hotels were eventually destroyed by fire. If we look at it from where it is now, this is where the Royal Hotel would have stood now, looks at it from across Main Road. This is known as the Royal Centre, a little development which does no justice to the Royal Hotel at all. And then the very ugly Kentucky Fried Chicken that some municipality allowed to be erected there. But that would have been, if maintained, would have been the lovely old facade of the Royal Hotel backing onto High Street. In an attempt by the architect to capture something of the old Hermanus, this building, known as Fashion Square, is located where the old Central Hotel was. And it has something of the flavor of the old hotels of Hermanus, certainly much better treatment than given to the Royal Hotel. Now, High Street, 1960 to 2019. It was a period of long decline, I'm afraid, for High Street. There were a number of reasons for this. First of all, the Group Areas Acts were implemented in 1963 in Hermanus, and this resulted in the eviction of many of the people who lived or worked in High Street. Many of the properties had to be put up for sale and were acquired by absentee landlords or owners of the building. A lot of very insensitive planning took place without any historical context at all. As I mentioned, some of the finest of the old buildings were destroyed by fire. It was also, oddly enough, a period of slow population and economic growth in Hermanus, and that didn't help with maintenance of historic streets. And of course, the development of the village square on the old market square sucked away a lot of the economic support to the businesses in High Street and the CBD in general. So it's a long period of decline through the latter part of the century. In 2000, the Hermanus came under the Overstrand municipality, and immediately the municipality implemented planning for Hermanus. Now, I've been able to identify no fewer than 14 documents which have a greater or lesser influence over what happened in the CBD and in High Street in Hermanus. It's difficult to think that that amount of planning was really necessary, but there it is. It runs into perhaps overall one is 334 pages, two others are nearly 100 pages, one has 370 pages. You're looking at well over 1,000 pages of planning material which precede the work that's been done recently on High Street. You have to make up your own mind about the degree to which this is necessary in a municipality. Nevertheless, out of these documents came 5 important points for the redevelopment of the CBD and by definition High Street. That it should ensure a sensitive response to the natural and built context and scale, should protect landscapes and old buildings and structures, enhance the historic grain and character of the CBD, enhance the relationship between the CBD and its landscape setting. The landscape setting is mainly the mountains behind it and the coastline in front of it, and distinguish old from new, but keep a visual harmony between them. Quite sound principles, and hopefully they will be applied as and when more development of the CBD takes place. The process of redevelopment really started with the issuing of contract number 2047 in 2019 for the construction of stormwater infrastructure for Hermanus CBD and the industrial area. Obviously, we're only concerned with CBD at present. There were a number of changes, which you will see in a moment, have come about in High Street because of this. First of all, provision should be made for substantial pedestrian access and control of vehicular traffic. Secondly, that there should be a single level surface across the old streets and pavements so people could move easily from one side of the street to the other. That the whole area should be lightened by the use of light-colored paving throughout. That there should be a focal point, now defined as the pergola, which a photograph of which I'll show you in a moment. That there should be adequate public seating and adequate signage, including historical signage, and that there should be as many trees and as much planting as was feasible in the area. And it's under those particular headings that the redevelopment, which all of you I'm sure have seen, have taken place in the last couple of years. Just to put you some idea of how the modern business stands, if you take the 1950s map as its basic head, the open area at the end of High Street and Main Road, which is shown here as an open area in the 1950s, is now where Woolworths and carriages are. The Twin Gables and Oderhof are where the Boucher's General Dealer and Housing was. The old Patterson House is now the Walker Bay Gallery and Cafe. This open plot has been incorporated into one or other of these. Warrington House is now a building housing Charter House and Flourish. The Van Dyck House is now Bay Haven and the Cuckoo Tree Restaurant. 3 flats accommodating the Allen employees are now Rossi's. There are a number of smaller businesses along this particular passage. The Royal Hotel has been replaced by the Royal Centre and the Central Hotel by Fashion Square, and these have blank walls facing onto High Street, about which I'll say something in a moment. Then there's a passageway, and then there's Ackermans, which was the old Van Blomstein House and Butchery. There was an open plot, which has now become Techie Town and Postnet. And then the Astoria Hotel brought the High Street to an end. Where Beach House, and the Beach House is roughly here. And then there's Candy's, Wine and Company, the parking area opposite Rossi's, where the pergola is now. The residence, the only home, the only bona fide family home in High Street still is the residence at number 13. Tutamen at number 15, Arthurst at 17, Studio 19 at 19, and then the optometrist at the house at the end of the road. I went out, or at least I went out with a photographer on Saturday and photographed. Here is the present view of High Street, looking from the Woolworths end. This is the pergola. Of course, it'll be less stark in due course as something has grown over it. You'll see the parking has been carefully prevented by the use of bollards, and the road has been leveled. However, traffic is already making oil stains on the road. This is Rossi's, and now once again open to view. And this is where the accommodation existed for the employees of the Adelphi Cinema. This is the corner of High Street nearest Woolworths, a cafe known as Oscar's. A market is now springing up there. This shows you one part of Oderhof Mall, which, as you can see, is quite consistent with the style of the town. And then the gallery, kitchen, and so on down. The most obtrusive, ugly building, in my view, is known as Bay Haven, this black building here, which only has garage doors facing onto High Street. Something the owners may be persuaded to do something about that. Here's number 15, the home of the Wrigley family in the 1950s, now owned by Mrs. Vanessa Pryor, who also lives here in an accommodation at the back. You'll see the planting of trees, which will eventually be much bigger than this and provide lots of shade. This is the remaining family house in High Street, number 13, just across from the parking area and the pergola. Here are the houses that were originally in High Street. This is where Govi Duplessis, the postman, lived. It's now become Candies, and that fits in, as you see, quite well with the ethos that is being developed. And here we have the back of the Royal Centre, where the back of the Royal Hotel would have been. Now, the back of the Royal Hotel is interesting because there was a public bar which was open to coloured people and a bottle store which was open to coloured people here. And obviously that, as I mentioned, indicated a certain level of heterogeneity in the people who frequented High Street. It's possible that we could run a competition for a mural extending along here, which would attempt to render an artist's impression of what the back of the Royal Hotel would have looked like in, say, 1940 or 1950. Okay, what are my conclusions? High Street reflected historically the spirit of early settlement, permanence and investment by people who originally came, as you know, only to fish. From 1900 to 1940, it was open to all, continuous extension and improvement of properties, early businesses and professional sites. By 1950s, it was fully settled, mixed and vigorous population. From 1960 to 2000, it declined. I've given you the reasons for that. And both ends were blocked off. They still are, both ends are still blocked off. And it became really a vehicle access and parking bay for people who lived and worked in High Street or Main Road. From 2000 to 2019, what I've called a protracted planning process, with extensive studies, a lot of bureaucracy, attention given to other areas other than the CBD, and general CBD decline. But from 2019, we detect a much more positive approach, a promising development, and hopefully that will lead the way for the CBD in general. Here are my acknowledgements for the work that's been done in putting this project, which you've seen today, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
That was very interesting, Robert. I enjoyed that very much, and I'm so glad that you're able to open on a positive note, and we keep our fingers crossed. That was a fascinating survey. Thank you.
Hi, Robin. I'm Deborah Odendahl. Thank you so much for your presentation on High Street. It was really excellent. My mother was Mary Magdalene Magda Odendaal and lived in High Street in the 1930s to the 1950s. As you mentioned, High Street was indeed very cosmopolitan. From the hotels at the one end, Dyer the fruit vendor who owned 4 plots in the vicinity of Beach House, and the Boucher store at the other end. Well, a brief history of the Wrigley family. Eric and Martha Wrigley moved into High Street in 1932. Eric Herbert Wrigley, a bookkeeper from Croydon, England, carpenter, entertainer, tap dancer, arrived in South Africa in the 1920s and was attracted by the ostrich feather boom in Oudtshoorn. From there, he made his way to Bredasdorp, where he met and married Martha Blom, and where the 4 eldest children, James, Ben, Molly, and Joey, were born. They ran the boarding house in Klipdale for a while. Though the beautiful old building still exists, it's now quite derelict. My mother, Mary Magdalene, not Magda, she was English speaking, was born in Bottrava, where they lived while waiting for the home in High Street to be completed. They moved in when she was 2 months old. Eric and Martha were very involved in village life. Eric as a bookkeeper and stand-in manager for some of the hotels when the owners were away, and Martha carving the Sunday and Christmas roasts for the hotels. She also created beautiful undergarments for the residents. Her claim to fame was that she baked bread for General Jannie Smuts when he visited Hermanus. She was a good cook, and the Jewish butcher's son would throw an illegal leg of pork over the fence during his delivery rounds for Martha to cook for him. Although later crippled by polio, Eric still remained active in all the goings-on and entertainment of the community, and friends would always each rock up with a different musical instrument at the Wrigley home to join in. On Christmas Eve, the post was delivered until late night, after which the weary postman would drop in at Eric's for a nightcap. The 2 eldest sons, James and Ben, as well as Kwesi de Villiers, Molly's husband, and my father's 3 older brothers all served in the Second World War in North Africa, some in Egypt and in Italy. Of course, as did most of the Hermanus young men in those days. James was an excellent car technician, and Ben excelled in rugby in Hermanus, eventually playing for Villagers in Cape Town with a shot at the Western Province team. Molly, whose in-laws owned the Warrington stores, was very artistic and did the window dressing and displays for all the Main Street stores. As 12-year-old, she played the role of Sari Marais on the Oxwagon during the Groot Trek commemorations in Hermanus. Joey started as a page boy in the Marine Hotel at the age of 14. He continued in hospitality in Zambia and Cape Town and returned to Hermanus to manage the Hermanus Golf Club for a while before returning to Cape Town. My mother, Magda, grew up and stayed in High Street from 1932 until 1954. She was christened in St. Peter's, went to Sunday school, sang in the children's choir, was confirmed, married, and buried from there. As 12-year-old, she used to help George Smith, who was the secretary of the British Empire Service League and a permanent resident in some of the hotels, including the Central, Astoria, and Royal Hotels, to collect money on the Main Street for the Service League. As a record-holding athlete in the Boerland Overberg region in her teens, her training ground were the few blocks around High and Mitchell Street. This was to the entertainment of the residents, who encouraged her as she endlessly ran round and round and round these blocks. Magda worked in the post office and trained staff as far as Gansbaai and Bottrava. She was also runner-up in the Miss Onion Queen beauty pageant. She married my dad in 1955, after which they moved to the Transvaal. But every December holiday was spent in Hermanus, eventually moving back permanently in 2013. Stanley, the youngest brother, was born in High Street in 1937. Stanley and Magda did all their playing under the large tree that still exists in Vanessa's garden, the current owner of Tutamen. Many a pet or bird's funeral was held in the garden, with much dreary singing to the amusement of the neighbors. Stanley left Hermanus as a teenager to pursue a career in telecommunications, became a very successful business owner, and returned to Hermanus permanently in 1990. He and his wife Bunny, who still lives in Hermanus, were very involved in village life, especially at the golf club and Aisletti. He sadly passed away in 2014.
Robin, I've added a few photographs of the Wrigley family. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Eric Herbert Wrigley, who was born on the 29th of October, 1889 in Dulwich, England. Apparently, while making his way to Hermanus from Bredasdorp, he drove the first motor car through Napier. He ironically died on his 66th birthday, the 29th of October, 1955. The same day, his grandson, Eric de Villiers, Molly's son, was born. The family photo was taken on the occasion of my mother's confirmation. It was taken in the back garden of the High Street home, in front of a tree that still exists today. On the left is Molly, my mom's only sister. The little girl in white is my mom, Magda, aged about 12. The little boy, Stanley, her youngest brother. Mom and Dad, Martha and Eric at the back, and older brother Joey on the right. Joey's claim to fame was that he served the then Princess Elizabeth while she was touring with the royal family through Rhodesia at the time.
Then I have a photograph of my mom when she was a teenager with Molly behind her, and Molly's son Patrick was their eldest. Then the photograph is of my mom, Magda, on Grotto Beach, and it was taken by my dad just after they got engaged. They were in church together as children and then lost contact in the intervening years, and they met up again when he visited Hermanus and was on his way for a swim to Fixpool, but never got there because he met up with my mom and it was love at first sight.
The wedding photograph was taken on the 17th of December 1955 in St. Peter's Church Garden. On the left is Samuel Jacobus Odendaal, my grandfather on my dad's side, who built the new harbour. Then Stanley Wrigley, the youngest son of the Wrigley family. My dad, Wessel Odendaal, and my mum, Mary Magdalene Odendaal, Magda.
Thank you once again, Robin. As I said, my mom would have been very proud. She was so passionate about Hermanus and its people, and she could drive down the street and tell you around every corner, this is where the Hamans lived, this is where Poppy de Kok lived. And I'm so glad that you've managed to capture this and that it will be saved for future generations, because these things get lost so easily. And you've done such a great job in putting all of this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to your family for assistance also with the new harbour vessel. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Robin, did you mention the passages that lead from High Street to the main road?
Yeah, no, I didn't, and that was an omission on my part. Let me hasten to add that. You will have seen from the various diagrams that there are a number of passageways, as they are called, in the old terminology. We tend to call them arcades, that run between Mitchell and High and between High and Main. And these were put in to facilitate pedestrian traffic from the streets beyond High Street for people who worked in the hotels on the seafront or in the Visby in the old harbour. And they were part of the original planning to have passageways so that people didn't have to walk around the whole of High Street in order to get to the Marine Hotel at one end or Harbour Road at the other end. And those are a very positive developmental aspect. Those arcades could be developed into real tourist attractions, with, seating outside the shops and nice displays and so on. And they're very, although they were put up for quite different reasons, they were put up to facilitate people moving through High Street to other streets. They're going to come in very useful in any redevelopment that might take place in future. Thank you, Angela, for reminding me.
Robin Gert, what is being developed in the stand opposite Rossi's?
Facing onto the road immediately is what we call the pergola. Those are the taller steel structure. That's going to be covered with creepers and have adequate lighting. And also a number of electrical connections will be installed there, or have been installed there. And the center behind will become a place where you could hold gatherings, meetings, outdoor exhibitions, and various other means of making the community come closer to High Street. So it's going to be kept as an open area. I presume when there's no event on, it may be used for parking, but it can also will also be available for events, outdoor events of various kinds.
Robin, do you know whether there's been any discussion about having any historical plaques on some of the buildings?
There has been discussion. I don't know what the current state is. Certainly there will be something on the pergola, because I've already given the wording that should go on that. But that's just very general about High Street, the date of it starting, and so on. But actually indicating particular sites, there are discussions regarding the most appropriate way to indicate that Rossi's, for instance, was the site of apartment accommodation for the employees of the Adelphi Cinema.
Thank
But
you.
that's a distinct possibility. Hedwig is the person who's been working with the municipality, and we have had discussions about actually having the historical elements noted.
We have been working on markers in the paving, and they have been put in the paving already, and they actually refer to the names that you have been mentioning in your document. They are part of the paving, so they're level with the paving. They are about 2 meter long steel plates that are part of the paving that has been built.
They won't be on the buildings because the buildings are not the original buildings generally, but they'll be in the paving. It's a long tradition of that, putting it in where people walk. And they look down and they see that they're standing right opposite Van Dijk's house or the Warrington's house.
Robin, in fact, the service station that you mentioned down High Street next to the walkthrough, that was a motor mechanics workshop, not a service station, according to my mom.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on behalf of us all, thank you very much for you and others for doing that important work for High Street. And now we can get really excited about the street being kept as it is, and it'll have a historical record. The people that are currently trying to improve our town are called Hermanus Revival, and the YouTube of this history will be available to them, so we can assist everybody get an understanding of how important the street is. So thank you, Robin, for a most informative talk.